If anyone has revolutionized the world of comics from a literary point of view, that person is the British scriptwriter Alan Moore. Over the last decade, he has taken both the North American and European markets by storm. His work on traditional characters has achieved two things: that readers again buy stories about superheroes, and that they can never take them seriously again. Furthermore, the creation of new series, together with the best artists, raises the literary level of comics to reach new, more cultured and demanding readers. A century of staring at the ceiling, longing to stretch, to yawn without the jaw falling off, longing to rub the cobwebs from your sockets with yellow pebbles. A decade counting the nails over and over. A decade studying the growth of a single fungus. 50 years struggling to remember what peaches smelled like. Generation after generation of beetles pass before your unblinking gaze. You watch the rise and decline of their miniature dynasties, making up names for each character, often repeating yourself. But it was no good. He couldn't sleep.
Well, I suppose that I went round to the back gate, poisoned the guard dogs and climbed over the fence, really. It was basically that I wished to get into comics, but realised that I couldn't draw anywhere near enough to compete with the people who were already making a name for themselves in mainstream comics, people like Dave Gibbons, Brian Bolland. What I decided to do was to go into comics through the easier route of sending in strips to the music press, where the standards weren't so high, and where it was much easier to come across as God's gift to the comics industry without really trying. So for a couple of years, I worked up on strips for the music press, gradually learning my craft until I was ready to actually move into comics proper as a writer. Basically, when I began working for American comics, I'd got a lot of fond memories of being a child, of reading about all of these ridiculous characters in their tight underwear and all the rest wrestling all between the skyscrapers of New York. And when I was approached to actually write for American comics, obviously I'd got a lot of nostalgic material to draw on, in that I'd read these comics since I was a child of 7. At the same time, I was old enough to realise that the material in those comics would have been laughable and simplistic for an audience in the 1980s, much as it had pleased me in the 1960s. What I decided to do was to try and take the characters that I'd loved so much when I was younger and see if I could fit them into a 1980s world, see what would happen to them if you applied the same logic to them as applies in the rest of our society, because comic book characters exist in a very different world to ours. They never grow older. They never seem to have to face up to any responsibilities for the things they do. I mean, when Superman and some supervillain or other knock down half of Metropolis during one of their fistfights, you never actually see who has to clean it up or who has to pay for the damage. What I wanted to do was to try and make the characters that I'd grown up with fit in terms of the real world as I understood it now, and to make them relevant to that world. I think that was basically what I was attempting. I wanted to say that people who are superior at physical fighting might not necessarily be superior morally, that their motivations might not be so squeaky clean and perfect as comic books have traditionally led us to believe, that sometimes people dress up in costumes because it excites them sexually. Sometimes they dress up in costumes because of egotism. In very few cases can I imagine anybody in the real world dressing up in a silly skin-tight costume with their underwear outside their trousers, unless they did have some form of psychological problem. I suppose in some of my stories, notably the very few Superman stories that I wrote, I did still tend to treat Superman as an icon, as an almost mythical figure. That's because with Superman, with his 40 years of history, he has somehow built up an aura around him. He is a classical, mythical figure. In most instances, however, I would rather perhaps... I don't know as I'd like to completely destroy the mythic resonance of comic characters, but I'd perhaps like to interpret it in a different way. In my series Swamp Thing, the central character, who had previously been a slime-encrusted version of Hamlet, basically, and that he just walked around covered in mud and feeling sorry for himself. In that book, I tried to get something genuinely mythical into it. I tried to make it a myth that would work in the 1980s. I tried to take Swamp Thing and turn him into a physical embodiment of the environment. Tried to use him as a symbol for everything that's happening with our ecology, with our planet. And in that sense, I was still staying very true to the mythic subtext of comics, but I was using it in a fashion by which I might be able to employ a little social criticism. Same thing goes, I think, for my work in Miracle Man. In Miracle Man, we have a god or a superhero who's very much in the same class as the traditional Nazi ideal, the Ubermensch, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy. And, I mean, this is pretty true of most superheroes in comics. They all have a disturbingly fascist subtext a lot of the time. With Miracle Man, or Marvel Man as we used to call it, I've tried to make that subtext obvious. I've tried to make people think about what godlike power means, what the idea of a Superman means. I hope I've not been heavy-handed about it, but we've at least tried to put these issues in front of the public so that they know what they're reading. So I'd say that, to some degree, I have continued to use the mythic nature of comics, but I have tried to subvert it, if you will, so that it can be used for more socially productive ends. I hope it will revitalise comics. As far as superhero or fantasy comics goes, I certainly have no further interest in them. I don't know whether I've reached puberty or what, but they don't seem to have the same appeal to me that they used to have when I was younger. I think I've probably worked a lot of it out of my system with the superhero work I've been doing over the past 4 or 5 years. I think that comics have certainly benefited from the new ideas that have been emerging over the last 18 months, not just mine, but ones by Frank Miller, the Hernandez brothers, Art Spiegelman, and so on. They've certainly received much more critical attention, serious critical attention, than they ever have before. As far as the superhero goes, however, as I say, for my part, I'm more or less finished with it. I don't think that when I was doing Watchmen or when Frank Miller was doing Dark Knight, that we really intended to save the superhero. I think it was more of an assassination job. Certainly with Watchmen, after finishing that, I really can see no point, at least on my own part, for ever doing any superhero material again. I've said all that I wanted to say. I can't really see much future for the superhero, except, well, Watchmen and Dark Knight have seemingly influenced a new generation of writers and artists who seem to have mainly picked up upon its grimness, which was not the only thing that I was trying to put over, but that seems to be what's been picked up upon. And to some degree, I can see superheroes just getting grimmer and grimmer and more depressing until they eventually just dissolve in a puff of black smoke. I think I probably prefer that to happen rather than to see the same old ideas and cliches being trotted out for another 30 or 40 years. I think that very often the American people, they sometimes look to Europe for an influx of new ideas. I think this has perhaps been true in rock and roll, and I think that of late it's been certainly true of comics. They have all of these wonderful forms that they've had kicking around for decades, but very often, except for the very best of them, they don't know how to use them. I think to some degree they were very happy that they had this new blood coming in from Europe, picking up these old concepts and ideas that had grown a little tarnished and stale and unoriginal, and breathing some new life into them. That's not to say that there weren't the occasional complaints. In Swamp Thing, I tackled a series of deliberately political issues, and whereas the Americans were very supportive when I was talking about feminism or nuclear waste or any of the other concerns I'm into, when it came to gun control, we got a deluge of angry letters. Apparently, the Americans can be quite liberal about their women or their coloured population or about their, atomic power facilities. But when it comes to suggesting that it might not be the best thing in the world if all of them were allowed to own guns without any qualifications whatsoever, that is where the Americans draw the line. I really, as an Englishman, had not expected to arouse such indignation just by suggesting that there should be stricter gun laws in America, but I think that was an instance where I'd misjudged the culture. That was the only time that I can remember when the audience actually did take strong offence at anything that I was saying. In the past, there has been a great deal made of the connections between comics and film, and you can see why. They're both visual media. They both tell their stories in a succession of pictures. And it's certainly true that a comic artist or writer who's got a grasp of cinematic techniques will probably do a better job than one who hasn't. But I'm very aware of the fact that if comics are only seen in relation to cinema, then the best they'll ever be is films that don't move, and that isn't good enough. Comics, like any other form of art, they have an area of things that they can achieve that no other medium can. Now, with Watchmen, taking, for example, the scenes in Watchmen where we suddenly zoom in past the characters upon a comic that one of the characters in the strip is reading, we zoom into the story in the comic, and so we have a pirate story that one of the characters in Watchmen is reading. Now, that gives us a lot of opportunities for striking dramatic counterpoints between the very grim modern-day world of Watchmen and the equally grim and barbaric 17th century world of the pirate story. In a film, I really can't see how that could be achieved so easily. There are a lot of properties in comics. For example, the fact that in a film, material will zip by and the audience will not necessarily have a chance to assimilate it, whereas in a comic they can turn back, they can stare at the page for as long as they like to make sure that they've absorbed all the tiny details in the background. Now, to some degree, this was what we set out to do with Watchmen, to do a comic that had effects in it, that did things that no other medium could attempt. And to some degree, the parallel narratives, the way of intercutting one scene with another, was a part of that. Yes, you can do it in movies with a split screen, but not half as effectively as if you have all the images upon one page at the same time in front of you. And so I suppose that was the reason why I did it. Basically, Watchmen was an opportunity to showcase some of the abilities of comics which have perhaps not had much of an airing before. When I'm writing a script, I try to approach it in much the same way that a screenwriter for a movie would, for example. I try to give the artist maximum information while at the same time not encroaching upon their freedom any more than I have to. I try to remember that the artist has got a much better graphic imagination than I have. But at the same time, artists have their off days. I mean, if their entire family had been wiped out by Hurricane Gilbert over the weekend, when they came to sit down on Monday morning, they might not be feeling in the best of moods for starting upon one of my comic strips. In that instance, what I try to do, if their head is a complete blank, if they don't have one single visual idea, what I try to do is to give them as much information as possible so that they have a jumping off point, and they also have a very clear idea of what I want to get out of the scene. Now, in terms of the actual physical structure of my scripts, what I do is, before getting down to the character's dialogue or to the narrative that goes into the caption boxes, I will give a very, very lengthy panel description for each of the individual panels in the story. This will basically tell the artist what the camera angle should be for the scene. You know, should it be looking down from the ceiling? Should it be looking up from the floor? It will tell them where the characters are standing, what their body language implies, what sort of facial expressions they have. It will tell you about the lighting. It will tell you about any extraneous background details. It will tell you basically about the whole physical scene, its atmosphere and its ambience. Now, once I've given that information to the artist, well, you can't afford to be a prima donna about it. As I say, the artist's got a better visual imagination. If he looks at all of that description and, having understood what you're after, decides that he's got a better way to achieve it, then I think that it's the essence of collaboration, that you let him go ahead with that. You let him express his creativity. I think there's nothing worse for a comic than tying an artist down and insisting that he follows your directions. That doesn't allow him any creative input of his own. And I think comics being a collaborative medium, it's really important that both halves of the equation are having the best time possible and expressing themselves as fully as possible. So basically, by doing my scripts like that, I try to eliminate as many problems in advance as I can do. I try to make sure that the storytelling flows smoothly, that the dialogue flows smoothly, that there are no pictures that I've asked the artist to draw which are physically impossible or are not good images. Having done that, it's more or less out of my hands. I send it off to the artist on a wing and a prayer and then wait and see what the finished job looks like. And in general, in fact, almost without exception, the artists have done me more than proud upon my work. I can think of very few jobs where I haven't been satisfied that the artist has put their very best into it. There were a series of rows, a growing dissatisfaction, and eventually I decided to leave the mainstream comics industry in order to set up my own company, which would be publishing comics by me and whichever artists I happen to want to work with and who happen to want to work with me. So the Batman stuff, the Superman stuff, that is some way in the past now. It was good fun while I was doing it, but as I say, I'm very dissatisfied with the way that the mainstream comic industry treats its creators. It seems to regard them mainly as cattle to be exploited for a fast buck. And I prefer to see myself as something more than that. I prefer to see the artists that I work with as something more than that. Hopefully with Madelove Publishing, which is the name of the company that we've set up, we will be able to explore comics entirely in the way that we wish to do so, without any of the unfair business practices that have dogged the industry for so long, bearing down upon us and breathing down our necks. It certainly feels very free and liberated to be actually putting out books with my own imprint on, rather than having to rely upon Marvel Comics or DC Comics or whoever else to publish them. Following on from this, we will be publishing my first major new novel since Watchmen, which is a 12-part series called The Mandelbrot Set, which I'll be doing with Bill Sienkiewicz. It's a big departure from science fiction and superheroes. What I've basically come to the belated realisation of is that the world around me, the real world that I live in, is much, much weirder than any alien planet that I could ever hope to imagine. I think I've started to come to the same conclusion that the science fiction writer J.G. Ballard has, that Earth is the last truly alien planet, and that is the planet that I hope to be exploring in all of my future work.